Hi. Thanks for listening to this talk. It's a shame we can't be together in person, but I'm glad to get a chance to speak with you about a really important and sensitive topic, and that's the question of what some journalists have referred to as the transgender moment that we are living in. 20 years ago, most people had no idea what the T in LGBT stood for, and we certainly weren't living in a political culture that viewed transgender rights as the human rights issue of our time. We certainly weren't living in a culture that was prescribing puberty-blocking drugs to minors, performing double mastectomies on teenage girls. How should we as Catholics think about this? How should we evaluate what's going on? How can we most lovingly respond to those who are experiencing gender dysphoria or who are confused about their own identities? That's what I hope to cover in this half-hour talk. We can't cover everything, and so I necessarily will have to be somewhat brief. But I do hope to give you kind of the lay of the land, give you an overview of what's going on and how you should think about it, both the ideas, but then also interpersonally, how you should most effectively bear witness to the truth and most effectively respond to someone with authentic compassion, authentic concern that's grounded in the truth. Let me start with a couple of stats. It was 15 years ago, 2007, that Boston Children's Hospital opened the nation's first pediatric gender clinic. Today, there are over 60 of these clinics, and the number keeps rising. And these are clinics where young people are being placed on puberty-blocking drugs, they're being given cross-sex hormones. In some instances, they're even having surgeries performed in their bodies. This is despite the fact that the best science that we have, the best evidence shows that somewhere between 80 to 95% of children with gender dysphoria will naturally grow out of it and will identify as the boy or the girl that they are if they're given the time and the space to continue maturing. This is despite the fact that the best science we have show that 41% of adults who identify as transgender will attempt suicide at some point in their lives, and that those who have transitioned are 19 times more likely to die by suicide than the general population. Those statistics are tragic. No one should be willing to accept a situation in which a certain segment of the population is 41 times more likely to attempt suicide, 19 times more likely to die by suicide. And the question is, how should we respond? What's the underlying problem that goes there? The other thing to point out is that no two instances of gender dysphoria or transgender identity or non-binary identity are the same. And in fact, I think there's quite a bit that's changing even within the past 5 years. Historically, gender dysphoria, that sense of alienation from one's body, was largely a phenomenon experienced by little children and by middle-aged, most frequently men. What we're now seeing is an explosion, I think 4,400% increase in the number of teenage and 20-something girls and women identifying as boys and men, or identifying as non-binary, or identifying as gender fluid. So there is something new under the sun in the sense that there seems to be a new phenomenon of what Lisa Lippman, a professor at Brown University, has referred to as rapid onset gender dysphoria. A situation in which particularly high school and college age girls and women with no history of gender dysphoria, no history of gender struggles, all of a sudden come out as non-binary or as gender fluid or as trans, and do so in clusters of friend groups. That's different than the phenomenon of the middle-aged man who identifies as a woman. That's different than the phenomenon of the young boy who identifies as a girl. So at least right there are three different genres or types of gender identity conflict. But even those aren't all going to be the same. Every young boy with a gender identity struggle, every teenage girl, every middle-aged man is going to be unique. And so that's also important as we think about these things, is not to kind of typecast and not to paint with too broad of a brush. That said, let me give you some analysis of the philosophical claims, the truth claims that are being made, the metaphysical claims, the anthropological claims, because I think that's going to be most helpful in how you think about the rhetoric that's being used in this moment, and most importantly, the claims about the nature of the human person that are being put forward. So first, what I frequently refer to as transgender ontology. I'm going to go through in 3 steps. First, transgender ontology, then transgender metaphysics, then transgender policy. So just 3 steps of analyzing what's being proposed as true and being proposed as demands for medicine and law. And then I'm going to pivot and turn to analyzing these claims. And so the first thing to say about the transgender ontology is that people say we live in a postmodern age that's rejected metaphysics. That's not quite true. We live in a postmodern age that is proposing an alternative metaphysic. At the heart of this transgender moment are claims about reality, claims about the human person. And these are ontological, metaphysical, anthropological claims. And the overarching claim is that a person is who they claim to identify as. Right? So the claim is that the transgender boy is a boy, not a girl who identifies as a boy. Or the gender non-binary person is non-binary, not a boy or a girl who identifies as non-binary. And it's understandable why activists would make these claims. A claim about who someone is much more powerful in the public square than a claim about how someone identifies. If it was just merely about how someone identifies, people would say, well, look, that's a mistaken identity. That's a misplaced thought, feeling, identity. If it's who someone is, that makes a metaphysical claim upon others. But these metaphysical claims aren't being debated and defended at the level of philosophy, because in our culture, the philosophers, the theologians aren't the real high priest. In our culture, the high priests are the doctors and the scientists. So it's being dressed up as a scientific and a medical claim. And what I do in the book that I wrote on some of the transgender ideology that's being promoted is I quote a variety of scientists and doctors who are putting this forward. It's been captured in a graphic. If we had more time, I would show you the graphic, but you can pull this up on your smartphone, on your computer. The genderbread person, the gender unicorn. These are images that are being used to kind of catechize a younger generation, not so much to persuade you or me, but to persuade our children, to persuade our younger brothers and sisters. And the idea is that the body is kind of the body itself is not normative. That the body is something that you as the individual need to answer certain questions about. What is my gender identity? What is my gender expression? What is my sexual attraction? What is my romantic attractions? And that these things need not all line up. And then the graphic explicitly says that sex is merely assigned at birth. The idea here being that you as a young person need to say, all right, my sex assigned at birth might be male or female, but my gender identity might be something else. It could be boy, girl, both, neither, somewhere in between. My gender expression is how I give expression to that inner sense of gender. My romantic attractions and my sexual attractions need not themselves be lined up. They need not be in accordance with my sex assigned at birth. They need not be in accordance with my gender identity or gender expression, et cetera, et cetera. That all of this, to a certain extent, is almost like a choose-your-own-adventure novel where you, the individual, either need to create your own truth or you need to discern it. And what's interesting here is that some of the trans activists are themselves inconsistent about this. Some suggest that there's a deep inner truth that you need to discover. Others suggest that this is something for the individual to create, that truth is a self-creation. It's a matter of individual autonomy, individual choice. Some say these two things need to go in conjunction, that the choice and the assertion and the autonomy is going to be one of introspection that you discover. How it all hangs together is somewhat confused. But the claim here is that when you assert that you are a boy trapped in a girl's body, or gender non-binary, or gender fluid, or gender ambidextrous, that's supposed to be the end of the discussion. That your inner sense of gender and your self-profession of your gender identity is determinative of the truth. Next is the four-part standard of care. So the idea here is that when a young person is persistent, insistent, inconsistent, that three-word phrase is repeated over and over, then they should be treated in accordance with their gender identity. So the idea here is that a young person, age 3 or 4, should be socially transitioned, the first step of the process, given a new name, a new pronoun, a new wardrobe, access to new bathrooms and locker rooms and sports teams. A second step is as that young person approaches puberty, they should be placed on puberty-blocking drugs, preventing them from going through puberty in the, quote, wrong body. A third step, this young person has now been locked in a child's body while the rest of their classmates have matured. So they should be prescribed cross-sex hormones, high doses of testosterone for the teenage girl who identifies as a boy, high doses of estrogen for the teenage girl who for the teenage boy who identifies as a girl. And then the fourth step, surgical transition, where various body parts could be removed and other body parts, or at least assemblages that resemble body parts, could be created using plastic surgery, with varying degrees of both cosmetic and functional success. That then leads the worldview of the person, which leads to the medicine, then leads to the public policy. This is where we see, I'll just cover it in 4 parts, what lessons will be taught to students in school, what will be taught as the truth about the human person and about human nature, how will access to sex-specific facilities and programs be governed? Will it be based on biology or will it be based on identity when it comes to bathrooms, locker rooms, sports teams, et cetera? A third, whose truth will you be forced to speak? Will you be forced to speak other people's truth claims, preferred pronouns, preferred names, et cetera, or will you be allowed to speak in accordance with what you believe to be the truth? In various jurisdictions, you can be fined for, quote, intentionally misgendering someone. And then lastly, provision of medical services. Will good medicine be prohibited? And what I mean by that is, will laws be passed that prohibit doctors, therapists, and other adults from helping a child identify with their body? And will bad medicine be mandated? Will healthcare plans, doctors, hospitals, and other institutions, when they have a patient struggling with gender dysphoria, will they have to go with that 4-part standard of care that I mentioned? The social transition, the puberty blockade, the cross-sex hormones, and the surgical transition. Right? That's 4 big areas of the public policy. All right, so in short, 10-minute overview, that's a thumbnail sketch of some of the philosophical claims, some of the medical claims, some of the public policy demands. Let me turn to, with the remaining time that I have, 15 to 20 minutes or so, how should we think about this? How should we analyze this? How do we respond to this? And the first thing to say is that our posture needs to be one of authentic compassion. And compassion means to suffer with another person. And for it to be authentic, it needs to be grounded in truth. You can't love someone if it's not grounded in truth. Charity and truth necessarily need to come together. And what this means is that we should recognize that people who are struggling with their gender identity, people experiencing gender dysphoria, people who might identify as non-binary or gender ambidextrous, they aren't faking it. They aren't making it up. They aren't doing this as a way of seeking attention. Although in some cases they might be influenced by peer groups, right? This is what's increasingly happening with the rapid onset gender dysphoria. But we should feel nothing but sympathy and compassion and want to help people who feel alienated from their bodies. And so whatever we do should be one of trying to help people reconnect with reality. This is going to look different for young children with gender dysphoria. It's going to look different for teenagers and 20-somethings experiencing an alienation increasingly from their female bodies. It tends to be the increase here is with high school and college-age girls and women identifying as non-binary or gender ambidextrous or identifying as men, and then middle-aged people who might identify as trans. For all of them, there are certain truth claims that are relevant. First thing to say, none of us are trapped in the wrong body because none of us are in bodies. We are bodies. No one's born in the wrong body because no one's born in a body. We're bodily beings. Part of the transgender claims reflect a deep body-self dualism, a form of Gnosticism, Gnostic dualism, in which the real self is something other than the body, and that we somehow inhabit our bodies, or we somehow occupy our bodies. The body is just a vehicle or a costume. That body-self dualism is both philosophically and theologically indefensible. It's something that both kind of the Aristotelian and the Christian traditions have rejected since day one. We are a dynamic unity of body and soul, matter and form. And what this means is that sex is a bodily reality. Our sex is determined by the bodily being that we are and how the organism is organized with respect to sexual reproduction. Organisms are made up of organisms are made up of organs which are organized in various ways to perform various functions. So you ask yourself, are you organized for what? Right? The sex of an organism is determined by how that organism is organized with respect to sexual reproduction. And there are two ways of being organized for sexual reproduction, a male way and a female way. And so when we say that there are males and females, there are men and women, it's based upon a claim that there are two ways of being organized with respect to the function of sexual reproduction, a male way that donates genetic material and a female way that receives genetic material and then allows for a new life to gestate. This is not based on sex stereotypes, right? This is based on an objective biological analysis of the organism. And this is true across the animal kingdom, right? This isn't just true for human beings. This is knowledge that more or less everyone can readily recognize. That's a male, that's a female, not just for humans, but across the animal kingdom. It's binary, it's stable. When I say it's binary, this is what I mean. There are two sets of sex chromosomes. There are two gametes. There are two genitals. There are two reproductive organs. There are two reproductive systems. What do I mean by this? There's XX and XY, penis and vagina, sperm and egg, testicles, ovaries. This isn't a spectrum. There's not a spectrum between sperm and egg. It's not a spectrum between testicle and ovaries, nor is there a third option, right? There's not a third sex chromosome. There's not a third gamete. There's not a third genital. There's not a third reproductive organ. So when people say that sex is a spectrum, or that the sex is not binary, it's not stable, that sex is somehow fluid, it makes no sense biologically speaking. Which is why frequently they'll make those claims about gender, not about sex. We'll get to gender in a minute, but for now, just stick with sex. It's stable. It's binary. It's based upon how an organism is organized with respect to sexual reproduction. There are certain disorders of sexual development. There are different ways in which an organism might not be fully developed with respect to sexual reproduction. And those are all diagnosable conditions. Some of them are caused by genetic conditions, some by hormonal, some by environmental. None of them yield a third genital or a third gamete or a third reproductive organ. None of them suggest that sex is a spectrum, even though it does reveal that in our fallen condition, not all of us are fully developed. And this happens in a variety of situations. We have disorders of cardiac develop, we call it heart disease. Disorders of respiratory develop, we call it lung disease. We also have disorders of sexual development, which are bodily, physical disorders where the body fails to fully develop along the male or the female trajectory. None of that has anything to do with gender dysphoria, though, or with gender identity that suggests gender exists along a spectrum, or that gender is fluid, or that gender can be reassigned, et cetera, et cetera. These all tend to be based on stereotypes. That transgender ideology tends to be based on certain stereotypes about what real boys do and what real girls do. That real boys like trucks and football and the color blue, and real girls like Barbie and ballet and the color pink, and that if you don't like the one set but you like the other, you might be trapped in the wrong body. When Bruce Jenner, as he was then called, became Caitlyn on the cover of the Vanity Fair. Many feminists spoke out against this because they said Bruce just transformed himself into this stereotypical pinup girl, right? That what's going on here is that he is trading on a bunch of stereotypes about what a real woman is supposed to look like and supposed to be, and that so much of the transgender ideology is actually based on sex stereotypes. All right, there are problems with this. Based upon what I've said about what's the truth about our sexual embodiment as male or female, based upon the transgender worldview's commitment to certain stereotypes, there are philosophical problems, epistemological, metaphysical problems, study of knowledge, study of being problems. Because what they do is the worldview is combining a form of that ancient philosophy of Gnosticism while also embracing materialism. It wants to say that only bodies exist because we're bodily beings, and they want to say that there aren't immaterial souls or something like that. And yet they want to say that we could be trapped in the wrong body. And it creates a contradiction of who or what is the real self trapped in the wrong body. Right? It wants to rely on these rigid sex stereotypes where boys play with trucks and girls play with dolls. But it also wants to say that gender is merely a social construct. And so if gender is merely a social construct, how you fit within a social construct based on stereotypes determine the truth about whether you're a boy or a girl, whether you're male or female, and therefore whether or not we should use surgery to reassign your body. So to highlight this, let me just ask you three sets of questions. If gender is a social construct, as the second wave feminists insisted, how could your gender identity, that is your identity with respect to what the activists are saying is a social construct, be innate and immutable? Right? How could you be trapped in the wrong social construct? Right? There's going to be a problem here of simultaneously insisting that gender is something other than sex, and yet you could be trapped in the wrong body based upon how you fit within certain stereotypes and constructs. Second, what does it even mean to have an internal sense of gender? Right? What does gender feel like? How do you sense it apart from having a body? Right? So once you separate sex and gender, once you say that gender identity is something other than the physical body, what meaning can we even give to that concept? To put this more concretely, for those of you with male bodies, those of you who are men, how would you know what it feels like to feel like a woman? Right? What is it to feel like a woman? And then how would you know if you were feeling like one? Right? So this is a question for actually both sexes in the audience. Women, do you all feel the same way? Have you talked to each other? Do you all have the same internal sense of womanness? Right? Is that what makes you all women, or is it that you all have the same type of organism? All of your bodily organism is organized towards the female way of reproducing, and that's what makes you all individual instances of the general category woman. Not that you all have the same internal feelings, but that you all have the same bodily form. So one question is, what does it feel like to feel like a woman? The other question is, for the men, how would you know if you were feeling like a woman? Right? What is the quality of, this is what it is to feel like a woman, right? This is why so many of the feminists say that we're just relying on stereotypes and that this can be so pernicious. Now, another question here would be, what would it feel like to feel like both a man and a woman, or to feel like neither a man and a woman, or to feel somewhere in between? You can see how the idea that gender being fluid, gender being a spectrum, just gives rise to certain forms of incoherence, where you're relying on stereotypes and then you're ultimately having nothing there. Final question, why should feeling a certain way make you a certain way, right? So why is feeling like a man going to make you a man? No one went along with Rachel Dolezal, the white woman who felt like she was black, identified as black, was running the local NAACP chapter, claimed to, quote, be black because she identified as black. No one said, she's transracial. What they said was that this was an imposter, this was a phony, this was a fake, this was someone appropriating the identity of African Americans. So why is it when it comes to sex and gender identity, we want to say that if you identify as a woman, you are a woman. If you, quote, feel like a woman, that makes you a woman. To a certain extent, you could think that gender identity, the way that the activists have described it, actually sounds a lot like religious identity. That's an identity shaped by certain beliefs. But here too, truth is going to be driving the train, right? So a Christian is someone who identifies as a Christian believes that Jesus is the Christ. Someone who identifies as a Muslim believes that Muhammad's the prophet. Well, the truth of the matter is that Jesus either is or is not the Christ. Muhammad either is or is not the prophet, regardless of what any of us believe. The same thing is true about our own identity as male or female, right? I either am or am not a man. You either are or are not a woman, regardless of what any of us believe, including what we as individuals believe. And so in the religious life, the point of our discernment, our prayer, is to line up our beliefs and our actions with the truth about God, right? It's not that our thoughts and feelings determine the truth about God. It's that we're supposed to line up our thoughts and our feelings and our actions with the truth about God. The same thing is true when it comes to our other aspects of our identity, including our gender identity. Right? Our thoughts, our feelings, our identity about our own embodiment as male or female should line up with the truth. Which means is that we need a healthy culture to cultivate nature. You can think about horticulture, agriculture. These are all forms of how we cultivate the earth, right? How we cultivate nature in the sense of like the environmental given. Well, human culture cultivates human nature. And so the question here is, how do we cultivate our nature as embodied creatures, male and female? There are certain sexual givens, right? That, men have certain reproductive organs, female have certain reproductive organs. The question for culture is, well, and how do we then cultivate boys to become men, to become husbands and then fathers, girls to become women, to become wives, to become mothers? That's why we're sexually embodied, right? Our sexual embodiment doesn't say who should be a doctor, who should be a nurse, who should be a lawyer, who should be a paralegal. Our sexual embodiment is meant for our ability to then unite as one flesh, as husband and wife, to then assume the vocations of husband and wife and of mother and father. And that means our culture needs to help that teleological trajectory, that developmental trajectory of the boy developing into a man to assume vocational responsibilities as husband and father, and girl to woman vocational responsibilities as wife and mother. And cultures can get this wrong in at least two ways. One is they can distort the differences between men and women. Men are from Mars, women are from Venus. Or they can deny the differences, right, and have an androgynous form of feminism in which equality means sameness. American culture has ping-ponged between those two extremes, right? Sometimes we have overly rigid sex stereotypes where men and women are, entirely different beings. On the other hand, we try to ping-pong back to say that they're interchangeable. I actually think that schizophrenia, where we're ping-ponging between them being very, very different, them being interchangeable, gives rise to some of the confusion, especially with young people, of not knowing what it even means to be a boy or a girl, a man or a woman. You couple that with a very toxic hookup culture, a very toxic sexual culture, and it's not surprising to me at all that so many young women are rejecting their womanhood. Right? This is probably one of the most toxic eras for that trajectory of girl to woman to wife to mother. And so it's not at all surprising that so many young women are rejecting that. But it's also not surprising that so many little boys are confused about what it is to be a boy. Right? So much of this is trading on stereotypes and bad cultural expectations. And so what we want to do here is, rather than distorting the differences or denying the differences, are reveal and communicate the differences that make a difference, cultivate human nature in ways that will actually allow for the human goods that our embodiment as male and female are meant to make possible. And that's going to be marriage, family life, and then the rearing of children. Okay, we could say more about that, but for sake of time, I want to continue specifically on some of the outcomes here. So the transgender philosophy is misguided. It's based on a faulty understanding of the human person as an embodied creature. It's based on a bad understanding of sex, a bad understanding of gender and gender identity. The other thing to say is that sex reassignment procedures don't work. And they don't work in a variety of ways. First is that they literally can't do what's advertised. You can't reassign sex because sex isn't assigned in the first place. Sex is an inbuilt reality, and that's why it can't be reassigned later. What we can do is we can masculinize female bodies. We can feminize male bodies, making them look more like stereotypical versions of the opposite sex, but we can't actually turn a man into a woman or a woman into a man. Nor can we turn them into both or neither, right? The idea that we could use surgery and hormones to create someone who was gender ambidextrous or gender spectrum, et cetera, et cetera. Sex is a binary, and the surgical attempts to reassign sex simply fail as a physical matter because sex wasn't assigned in the first place. It can't be assigned later in life. What we can do is various forms of cosmetic surgery and hormone therapy to change our external genitalia, our internal reproductive organs in terms of removing them, our secondary sex characteristics. But that doesn't actually turn a man into a woman into a man, or either into both or to neither. This then explains part of the reason why it also has bad psychosocial outcomes. Just as sex reassignment doesn't physically reassign sex, it also doesn't adequately address the underlying discomforts that led the person to seek out surgery in the first place. Now, this is particularly tragic for people who think it is going to bring them the lasting happiness. When I was researching my book, the chapter that was most difficult to write and the chapter that actually convinced me I had to do a book on this was a chapter on people who had transitioned as teenagers, 20-somethings, even later in life, thinking it would solve their problems. They felt a sense of discomfort from their bodies. They didn't feel comfortable in the body God had given them. They thought by taking testosterone, having a double mastectomy, it would bring them healing, wholeness, completeness, and it doesn't. Right? And then 5-10 years later, they detransition. Those stories are utterly tragic, and they aren't just kind of anecdotal. The best science we have shows that neither hormonal nor surgical transition improves the psychosocial outcomes for people with gender dysphoria. The largest data sets we have, the longest studies that we have show that the underlying depression, anxiety, suicidal thoughts, suicide attempts, substance abuse, drug abuse, alcohol abuse, et cetera, that surgical and hormonal transition doesn't alleviate those tensions. And so now imagine that you feel so distraught, so depressed, so anxious, so alienated from your body that you would be willing to go through these hormonal and surgical procedures, and then 5-10 years later, it doesn't bring you the healing, the wholeness that you're looking for. That's the tragic situation of many people who have been sold a lie by the activists, by the gender experts who are pushing these therapies. All right, last thing I'll say about this is for children. The medical treatment for children is entirely experimental. There are no long-term studies on what these outcomes are. We have no idea what it will mean for a generation of young people not to go through their natural biological puberty. Not only what this will mean for their identity, but what this will mean for their bodily development. It's not just our sexual reproductive organs and systems that develop during puberty, but our entire body, our musculature, our height, our bone depth, our brain, all sorts of bodily systems in an integrated, coordinated way develop during puberty. And so placing a child permanently on puberty-blocking drugs is purely experimental. This isn't FDA approved for this purpose. We have no idea what the outcome will be. The experts claim it's reversible, but two things to say about that. One, blocking puberty for a number of years and then stopping to block puberty doesn't reverse all of those years of blocking. And so we also don't know what going through a developmental process at age 16 that you're supposed to go through at an age 11, we have no idea what that looks like. And then secondly, we don't even know if it's fully reversible in terms of, once you go off of the puberty blocking drugs, if normal biological puberty will recommence. Most of the people who are placed on puberty blocking drugs go forward towards the next stages of cross-sex hormones and surgery, which leads to the third concern that this is a self-fulfilling treatment protocol. That if you tell a young person they're trapped in the wrong body, if you socially transition them, if you give them puberty blocking drugs, you may very well be locking in the gender dysphoria, locking in the discomfort from the body. And that's what's particularly disconcerting here is that whereas the science that I mentioned at the very beginning is showing 80 to 95% of young people, if you just gave them the time and the space to continue developing, would naturally grow out of gender dysphoria. Some of the early studies that we have show 100% of the patients being placed on puberty-blocking drugs or going on to cross-sex hormones, suggesting it's a one-way ratchet, that once you start this process, it's not hitting the pause button the way that some transgender doctors talk about this, but it's actually pushing things in one direction only. So what's the alternative? The alternative is to try to identify what the underlying causes are and addressing the underlying causes. The analogy that Dr. Paul McHugh uses is to anorexia. No physician would prescribe liposuction to a teenage or college girl experiencing anorexia because the problem is not with her body. What a doctor would do is try to figure out what the underlying cause is. Is it an eating disorder per se? Is it a body image problem? Is it caused by unrealistic expectations from school, from family, from a romantic partner? Is it the result of trauma, sexual abuse, family dynamics? No two instances of anorexia are going to be the same. In every individual case, there's going to be a unique set of underlying causes. And what a good treatment protocol would do is figure out in this circumstance, what is it that's leading you to have your struggle with body image or with eating, et cetera, et cetera. Same thing is true with gender dysphoria. Give people the time and the space to process that struggle without tinkering with their body, without blocking puberty, doing cross-sex hormones, performing surgery. And then in simple talk therapy, talk about, well, what is it about being a boy that makes you uncomfortable? What is it about being a girl that you think would be a solution to your struggles? What's going on at school? Are you being bullied by other boys? Are you being rejected by other boys? Is there trauma in your history, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? In the book, I give a variety of examples from case studies of people who either themselves were being bullied and that was leading to the trauma, or their parents had had a traumatic experience in which the parent couldn't be as affectionate with the child, and that was leading to the child to experience gender dysphoria. No two cases are the same. And the alternative, rather than doing what's impossible, right? What's impossible, reassigning a body to line up with misguided thoughts and feelings, the alternative is to do what is possible. Help someone line up their thoughts and their feelings and their identity with reality. And for Catholics who have a vocation of bearing witness to the truth in love, that should be our response to transgender ideology, to teach the truth about the human person, and then to accompany people who are struggling with gender dysphoria, who are struggling with their own identity, and to help them line up their thoughts, their feelings, and their identity with reality, including the reality of their own body. Thank you for watching, and I hope next time we can be together in person.